Today, we are going to discuss the principles of heredity and genetics. Before you complete these notes, be sure to complete the What is Heredity and What is a Trait sections at the Tour of the Basics website. You must also complete Mendel's Laws of Genetic Inheritance animation. It is important to watch all three of these animations to better understand the podcast. Pause the video to complete these activities before you continue. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk in the 19th century who did a lot of research that scientists still use today. He is the person who's given credit for the branch of science called genetics. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity, or the passing of traits from parent to offspring. Gregor Mendel completed thousands of experiments with true breeding plants. True breeding plants produce offspring that are genetically identical to the parents. Based upon these experiments, he discovered how traits are passed from parent to offspring during sexual reproduction. Now, he conducted experiments with plants, but the principles of heredity that he discovered applies to all organisms that reproduce sexually, even humans. Let's refresh our memories about how plants reproduce so that we can better understand his experiments. Remember, the stamen of the flower is the male part of the flower that produces the sperm that is carried by the pollen. The carpel, sometimes called the pistil, is the female part of the flower that produces the ovules or eggs. When the sperm fertilizes the ovules, a zygote develops which will be enclosed in a seed. In order to perform specific genetic crosses in plants, Mendel would cut off the stamens of the flowers and carry out pollination by hand. He would go from flower to flower, touching specific stamens to specific pistils. Can you imagine how tedious this work must have been? In doing his experiments, he came up with the principles of genetics that still hold true today. By crossing hybrid plants, or plants that were produced by parents with different traits, he determined that traits are inherited by parents passing on alleles to their offspring. An allele is a different form of the same gene. For example, in humans, eye color is a gene. Blue, brown, and hazel would be the alleles for that gene. In plants, seed color is a gene. Green, yellow, and white would be alleles for that gene. Also, in plants, stem length is a gene. Tall stems and short stems would be the allele for that gene. By doing genetic crosses with his hybrid plants, he also determined that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. Dominant alleles are always expressed even if you only have one allele, whereas you have to have two recessive alleles for the recessive trait to be expressed. For example, a plant only has to have one allele for tall stem length to have tall stems, but has to have two alleles for short stem length to have short stems. Here's a diagram that shows the types of crosses that Mendel performed and helps explain some of these genetic principles. First, he crossed two true breeding plants, a tall plant and a short plant. This cross produced hybrids, plants that had parents with two different traits. In this case, the hybrid offspring from the tall and short parent plants are all tall. When these hybrid plants are allowed to reproduce, some of the offspring are short and some are tall, proving that alleles are passed from parent to offspring through many generations and are not lost, but simply some are dominant and some are recessive. To better illustrate this, we are going to use probability and Punnett squares. Probability is the likelihood that something will happen. So Punnett squares are not used to predict actual outcomes of genetic crosses, but instead they are used to predict what will probably happen. A Punnett square is simply a tool that will allow you to predict the possible combination of alleles that offspring will have. Thus, they can be used to predict the possible genotypic and phenotypic ratios that would result in a genetic cross. Let's take a look at Mendel's hybrid plants. Remember, hybrids are offspring that are created from parents that have two different traits. When using a Punnett square, the male alleles are written along the top and the female alleles are written along the side. In this case, both of these hybrid plants have one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems. Now we're going to see what type of offspring they might create. This Punnett square shows us that we would have some offspring with tall stems and some offspring with short stems. As you can see from the Punnett square, the alleles in a Punnett square are represented by letters. The letter used is determined by the dominant trait. Since tall stems was dominant, we used a capital T to represent the tall trait, and we used a lowercase t to represent the recessive trait. To better help you complete Punnett squares, it is important to know several terms. Homozygous traits are those that have two identical alleles. Heterozygous traits are those that have two different alleles. The prefix homo means the same, and the prefix hetero means different. The phenotype is an organism's physical traits, or what it looks like. An organism's genotype is their genetic makeup, or what allele combinations it has. The phenotype is determined by the genotype. In other words, a person's genes determine what they look like. So let's get back to the Punnett square that we looked at earlier. Both of the parents were hybrids. They were the result of parents with two different traits. These hybrids had the potential to produce offspring that have both tall and short stems. Let's look at the probability that this Punnett square predicts. These two hybrid plants have a 75% chance or probability that they will have tall offspring. This does not mean that for every 4 offspring they will have 3 tall ones. This only means that every time they have offspring, there is a 3 out of 4 or 75% chance that they will be tall. This Punnett square also predicts that when these two hybrids have offspring, there is a 1 in 4 or 25% chance that the offspring will be short. Let's take a closer look at the allele combinations of the offspring. There is a 1 in 4 chance that offspring will be homozygous dominant. This means the offspring has 2 of the same alleles and they are both the dominant form. There is a 2 out of 4 chance that the offspring will be heterozygous. This means that they have 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. Notice that these offspring are still tall. Offspring only need 1 dominant allele to have the dominant trait. The recessive allele is masked or covered up. These hybrid plants also have a 1 in 4 chance of producing offspring that are homozygous recessive. This means that 1 in 4 will have 2 recessive alleles. Notice that this is the only gene combination that will produce short stems. 2 alleles are needed to have the trait when the trait is recessive. This brings us to the genotypic and phenotypic ratios. The genotypic ratio in this cross is 1 to 2 to 1. We have 1 homozygous dominant as represented by the yellow square. We have 2 heterozygotes as represented by the blue squares, and 1 homozygous recessive as represented by the pink square. So again, our genetic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. Remember, we are just looking at the allele combinations for the genotypic ratios. The phenotypic ratio is a little different. Remember, phenotype refers to physical characteristics. So you must first decide, what do these organisms look like? The phenotypic ratio is 3 to 1. In other words, 75% of the offspring may be tall, while 25% may be short. Remember, Punnett squares only predict probable outcomes. They do not predict what will actually happen. Every time these two plants produce offspring, they have a 75% chance of producing tall offspring and a 25% chance of producing short offspring. Now you are ready to complete some Punnett squares of your own.